facilitate international relationships and the transaction of luxury commodities. After selling the network and moving on, he founded Florida Transatlantic, a strategic defense consultancy with a focus on armored vehicles, facial recognition, and defense technologies. In conjunction, he is a frequent political commentator on the BBC, as well as a multitude of both British and international media organisations. Alongside his extensive experience, personally and professionally, across Africa, South America, and the Middle East, he also has strong ties to Turkey, where he was born. Academically, he holds a BA with honours in history from the University of California, Berkeley. Additionally, he holds an MSc with honours in economic history from the University of St Andrews. Notably, he is the recipient of multiple academic and governmental research grants to conduct archival research across the United States, Germany, and the United Kingdom. Currently, he splits his time between the UK and the USA, and he's just said that he's been travelling across the world, from Brazil through to America now, and back and forth. So welcome, Erol. Thank you very much again. Over to you.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I apologize for the miscommunication last week on the time difference. So I'm glad that everybody took the time to come back, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. I guess we'll get right to it. I'm going to kind of explore a combination of foreign policy, trade, and COVID in connection to the Trump administration. We'll just go a little bit through that. Obviously, in the time we have, can't go too in depth, and then we'll open up to Q&A because I'm sure that's the more, let's say, fun part of it. So to start, we'll take a look at foreign policy, as seen at least through the lens of Trumplandia, his supporters. And first for that, we have to take a brief glance behind ourselves at where we really came from, and that would be, in the interest of bluntness, this sort of former Democrat-Republican oligarchy, that it was in the pocket of Big Pharma, Big Oil, and most brutally the military-industrial complex, your Raytheon, Northrop Grumman's of the world, Lockheed Martin, even our friends at Boeing, who are going to be making more things than airplanes, although if you look at their stock price right now, perhaps they're not going to be making airplanes much longer. And this was born out of what was an increasingly defunct American political system, where our leaders progressively became weaker and concurrently more trigger-happy than those before them. And these are the people who entrenched $6 trillion of U.S. treasure, the birthright of a generation, in the Middle East, left the blood of thousands of American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of innocents soaking in those hot desert sands. That same cohort who signed NAFTA and other trade deals that shipped American factories and jobs abroad and gave China most favored trading status they needed to rise as a superpower in the Pacific. Formerly, it seemed like the strategy was to believe the United States was a personal plaything of strategic influence enhancement, and at all costs, that was the goal. Despite all of that, they subsequently saw Russian invasions of the Ukraine and Georgia, surged troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, destroyed the international reputation of America as a force for good, destabilized nations, where we saw in Libya with the international slave trade reoccurring, and overthrew leaders, all while refusing to negotiate or speak with nuclear adversaries like North Korea. You saw a NATO alliance that was tattered, underfunded, after maybe last being utilized in the Balkans by President Clinton. And now in a post-Soviet world, there'd been a collection of countries that had been spending less and less while the American taxpayers shouldered the burden. And so with that quick lens into the back, this is where we started to see some separation with the Trump administration and those before him. As a nearly third-party outsider candidate whose 2016 campaign was funded completely without the traditional gatekeepers that one must go through in this broken American political system, Donald Trump is sort of a unicorn of American political theater. Things had gotten so bad that people in Congress would joke that they can only actually accomplish anything, which would be raising money. And on the Hill, that's not really a joke. And it comes with caveats. That money wasn't free. It isn't free. The same way a corporation donates to a museum. There's no such thing as, let's say, corporate charity in a world of political fundraising. It's just opportunity. You have candidates like Joe Biden, who publicly stated on camera, when you get a large amount of money and somebody wants to talk to you after the campaign, you open the door. It's sort of a quid pro quo style of normal traditional politics, and that's sort of how power brokers and voice is given. But after 47 years in office, you start to wonder how many deals somebody's made. Evidently, the deals that President Trump made during his first 3-4 years did not really seem to emphasize that American imperialism by force. as part of his social contract. When you look at 2 terms and 540 drone strikes later after the Obama administration, which normalized armed drones and counterterrorism and close air support operations in non-battlefield settings, namely Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia, and troop surges that reached 100,000 at its peak in 2011, concurrently with the rise of ISIS, which warped ideology of a false sense of what Islam was, but created this bugaboo, especially for the election coming up. Now, today, ISIS has lost 99% of its territory, for all intent and purpose, has been wiped off the map, alongside terrorists like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and more interestingly, Qasem Soleimani, which is maybe a different discussion entirely. As opposed to weakness and indecisiveness, Trump supporters see that these blustering troop surges and additional conflicts, they see President Trump using tactical airstrikes and made sure it was clear to our allies for the first time that the U.S. taxpayer can't simply shoulder that burden for eternity. Meanwhile, in stark contrast to Mr. Obama, who really was the fulcrum upon which this tilted, who was a Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Trump has drawn the numbers of troops down in Afghanistan to under 4,000. When you see him go and talk to these parents who've lost children for almost nonsensical swaths of road in the Middle East, you can like him or not, but he certainly does seem genuine when he sees the pain and suffering as not being worth the blood and treasure. And he talks about bringing these men and women home before Christmas. This blindsided military officials who are usually controlling the chain of custody, and that's how they keep us entrenched, because there's always a review and a next process, and you can never get there because they never want to get out. Somebody who works in defense myself, it's quite just a vile group of people who want to keep war going on. I mean, I would make a lot more money if we started to go to war in Syria, but I'm not the kind of person who thinks that's the way to make money. But in that business, there's a lot of people who have that powers. Anyway, after 19 years, President Trump said, enough is enough, and in many ways, this is why a civilian president instead of the military is our commander in chief. I actually worked on a financing project for a hydroelectric dam in the Kajaki region, and we had to stall talks as the peace deals came along with the Taliban. It was interesting to see how the World Bank was actually basing future infrastructure funding on that region based on these new peace deals coming in. And, energy and these sort of access to power, especially in places that have no electricity, these are kids who are going to perhaps have a future just to access the basic things. So these are some of the things that we look at in terms of that side of geopolitics. Another thing that's huge for the Trump supporter is NATO. In his last speech before stepping down in 2011, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, offered a very dark warning to his fellow ministers, basically saying, quote, "Spend your money on your own security or the American taxpayer may lose patience with paying for European defense." And at that time, the U.S. accounted for 75% of all NATO defense spending, which was up from only 50% a few years earlier. Those were ominous words as an organization that was the cornerstone of global foreign policy looked to be in slow decline. After that Soviet threat faded into memory, the same alliance perhaps felt they could get away with being just social country club members without paying the dues of the full country club, we can say. And so, as usual, again, President Trump led by example, and because, come on, America first, that's his thing. He pumped $2.5 trillion into our depleted military, which reinforced our real commitment to international security as the current hegemonic power of this age. And keep in mind, the U.S. military is not just planes and bombs, but the single largest mobility ladder for skills and access to capital for education in this country. No organization has trained more first-generation immigrants or integrated them into the fabric of the nation like the U.S. military. So it's not all just like tanks and this kind of things. It's a social project. His public lambasting of NATO members, allies, you can say, for their flippant financial treatment of their American cousins, he sternly told them things would need to change. And, Europeans rarely like to be lectured to by arrogant, loud Americans. But there we have it. Perhaps decades of sending appeasers over who much more wanted to be the beloved friend of the global elite, i.e. John Kerry, than do the job of their countrymen, had sent them, maybe our allies forgot the true bluntness of Americans when it comes to money. But right now, regardless of tact or guile, the proof of concept is in the resulting numbers. From 2015 to 2019, non-U.S. NATO countries increased defense outlays by more than 20% to $302 billion. We saw gains in 2015 of 1.7%, going to 3% in 2017, and 5.7% and 4.5% each in 2018 and 19. Germany still has failed to join that 2% club, and hence there's been troop drawdown, especially in regard to the Nord 2 pipeline, which is maybe another debate to talk about. And the U.S. actually increased its spending from 660 to 685 billion, and total defense outlay by 2020 should stop 1 trillion. You see this commitment of 2%ers, new nations that have come out, and the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg has come out and thanked Trump as the only person who was able to get the alliance back on track. And that's a cornerstone of everything. I mean, if you look at never forget that while Obama gave Ukraine non-lethal aid, it was President Trump who gave them the munitions and armaments to repeal future Russian invasions. They called Russian collusion. They said Trump's a Russia lover. Well, under Trump's watch, most military strategists are confident that Crimea would not have been lost. At that time, probably in aggregate it would have. But Obama's weak foreign policy department with the red line in Syria against Assad was countered by Trump, who put tactical strikes on Syrian air defense zones as soon as they tried to get him to call or bluff. When Trump got tested, he quickly ended the test, and that was something that his supporters and voters going to the booth on Tuesday are going to see. He might not be an orthodox president, but these are unorthodox times. It's a clear and present international leadership demonstrating that nationalism does not mean isolationism. The same can be true in Europe as the United States. The rekindling of the alliance is paramount, for tipping that power balance in the 21st century further in the direction of NATO and away from rising powers in the East. And most importantly, in the realm of American foreign policy, and I think this is the really key metric for a lot of voters and a lot of new voters who are coming into the party, or at least are going to be voting for President Trump, is that Donald Trump is the first U.S. president since Ronald Reagan to not start a war. Even Bob Woodward has conceded this fact in all of his anti-Trump books that Trump inexplicably keeps giving him access to write. Really, the confidence this man has, just come on in, write whatever you... It's very bizarre. He's for a person who they shroud in secrecy, he's about as transparent as you can get. I mean, but it's incredible. If you're going to have some sort of aggregate, this is the outlier of outliers. Since the campaign finance system changed and the military-industrial system got their hands on it, that famous speak softly and carry a big stick foreign policy of Theodore Roosevelt seems to be returning, from North Korea to NATO to the Middle East with the new Abraham Accords, Israel, UAE, Bahrain, now including Sudan, hopefully, and Saudi Arabia opening up airspace, which is tremendous. These are transformative times, and Trump is, again, the fulcrum upon which this era of peace has been perched on. He fights his wars with calculators, not bombs, as we see in Iran, with the economy reduced 90%. The leadership has been frozen out of the international community. They had, according to our voters and our supporters, been seeing the U.S. taxpayer being played for a fiddle. And, while they call for the atomic destruction of our greatest ally in Israel, and keep in mind, Trump is the only one to have moved that embassy to Jerusalem. Every single president promised that in a campaign. It was an easy campaign promise. And then the military-industrial complex would get in the way. Oh, it's insurmountable. It'll cost billions of dollars. You can't do this. Well, when you don't have any... nobody paid you to be there all of a sudden for $500,000, $500,000 or less. They just moved the embassy. Like it or not, that's something that every president had promised. So it's promises made, promises kept, which I think, again, is something that's resonating. Whether or not people who dislike him agree with his promises, he does seem to keep them. But, with that said, let's move to maybe a more business-tilted thing, talk about trade, at least in the way we Trump supporters are going to look at it. And again, we have to quickly look backwards just to see the comparative styles. You have NAFTA coming in, the North American Free Trade Agreement, January 1st, 1994, opening up the USA, Mexico, and Canada to all free trade. Prior to that, it had only been USA and Canada since 1989. In 1994, also, President Clinton reversed a campaign pledge, and granted China the coveted most favored trading nation status, which laid the groundwork for the coming decimation of the American manufacturing and production centers. Now, this is not to lay the blame on China or besmirch their monumental economic achievement over the past 30 years. It's, tremendous. It should be put on a pedestal. And if anything, we're jealous. But when we talk trade, it must be noted that while this did phenomenally well for Wall Street and the transnational corporations that trade on their exchanges, it did not do very well for Main Street and Joe Sixpack, who saw his factory ship off and who was sold the car he used to make at 6.6% interest by the same bankers who had put him out of the dignity of an honest labor. And now he's on the government dole in former crumbling industrial cities that littered the Midwest. Places like Detroit, Michigan, in 1960 had the highest GDP per capita in the world. The richest city in the world eventually would file bankruptcy in 2013. Unprecedented. Never in history has a country that has still increased. The country hasn't collapsed. Their richest city went bankrupt. Unprecedented. Never been seen. It'd been stripped for its last copper pipe that had been shipped off to be smelted in a Chinese factory by then. And this is the type of trade policy that President Trump inherited in decades of in his decade as an American businessman. gave him a unique insight into the problem. And you heard him in the 70s talking about, Japan eating our lunch. When the auto industry was getting, blown away by cheaper cars. Now, there's a lot of global reasons for that. There's a whole other debate. It's not that that was a bad thing technically. But the solution is that he had a solution that nobody else had been able to articulate or had the courage to take on. But before going to China, he started to reimagine trade in our own backyard with the USMCA, which was the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, a deal that Biden has on camera admitted is better than NAFTA. And I just want to mention a few notable points. You have automobiles that now have to have 75% of their components manufactured in the US or Canada to qualify for zero tariffs. And 44 to 45% of parts have to be made by workers who make $16 an hour by 2023. Mexico passed huge new labor laws, especially making it easier to unionize. And interestingly, you saw Japanese factories that were going to move back to the U.S., seeing the political climate and saying, you know what, why don't we just pay them $16 an hour? We already have the factory there. And so you're seeing this very interesting side note. You also have U.S. farmers, which is huge in Wisconsin, which is a big swing state coming up. Of getting access to the Canadian dairy market. There was 214% tax on milk, and while it made for funny headlines and you could laugh, the president's talking about milk. Well, that really matters to people who, and that's a huge part of their economy, and you have industrial, milk farms and whatnot. So that new thing was a big deal. Intellectual property, which will tie into the new deal with China later on, extended digital copyrights for 70 years and, brought in new protections for things like e-books and in the digital economy. And then the most important part, this new deal had a sunset clause. In 16 years, the deal's over. Every 6 years, you can review it and say, you know what, this is no good because modern economies are fluid. They're living and in like this Hammurabi's code where we're hammering the rules into a stone tablet for trade isn't the same thing as a Bill of Rights. And so I think this was something that a businessman would put in there. You always have a duration clause in any contract I've ever signed. You don't just get things into perpetuity. And finally, this goes past any U.S. agreement, prior U.S. agreement to help reduce costs and bring greater predictability to cross-border financial transactions, which is big for the Mexican Latino vote, who have a huge amount of remittance payments. Billions and billions of dollars going back and forth. And as we see his Latino support grow, that was a huge part of that new Trumpian strategy, and he took that fresh slate to other regions around the globe. He strongly favors bilateral relationships versus the multilateral agreements that are often written in ways that are insensitive to certain sectors. But since the deal is a broad agreement, the displeasures get left behind in the name of progress. By withdrawing from the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and moving towards bilateral agreements with, currently with our allies such as Japan and South Korea, he was able to guard his constituents, the American worker, who would have had over 18,000 tariffs that protected their labor and dignity removed in the interest of unchecked globalism by the same people who decry the destruction of the environment but want to simultaneously jumpstart exotic trade routes, but that's also another debate. Trump rightly saw this as a bid to take the power from the American nation state and a direct threat to the American labor, who had witnessed everything from South Korea dumping Samsung washing machines, which I actually have, it's a great washing machine, to the Chinese dumping steel on their shores in a bid to take market share and drive American companies out of business, at least how his voters are seeing it going into the election. Now, keep in mind that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are more similar on trade than Biden and Trump. The concept of putting the workers first, the little guy ahead of Wall Street profits, is the purview of populists because they speak for the people. Globalists and establishment folks can always show you a flow chart that indicates a greater good, but that isn't what works anymore, especially when 80,000 Americans have died of opioid overdoses every year by drugs that flood through our borders either by sea or land. A lot of Chinese-made fentanyl, which President Xi has actually been really productive in working with President Trump and has been an ally in. He's seen the devastation that's wreaked on our community, especially my generation. I mean, people I went to high school with, you would have thought we went to Iraq. I mean, there's pictures, and like 3 of the guys are gone, and you would never have expected it in some of those communities. Anyway, but the American people were sick and tired of it. And when their communities were as ravaged as their wallets and their young people were hooked on deadly drugs, they looked for a voice of reason in the sea of chaos. And amazingly, it only came from Donald Trump to them. And that strong protection of the American working class also came via tariffs on China and subsidies for our farmers that were able to deflect the Chinese attempts to hold American politicians as hostages by cutting off soybean and corn sales. I mean, it was so comical. It was like, oh, well, we'll just stop buying your soybeans, so you'll do what we say. And apparently that worked for a few years. They were like, yeah, we can't rock the boat there. Just the soybean sales, we couldn't possibly ever innovate our way out of this problem. So a lot of what Trump does isn't like genius. It's almost just Like, man, that hasn't been done yet. That's weird. Nobody filled out that form. Okay, somebody can do that. But, an establishment man wouldn't have been able to do that. He would have been instructed not to rock the boat, and he wouldn't have stood up to China. And the voters are seeing that. And the resulting China 1 and 2 trade deals are going to be monumental redesigns, especially in the intellectual property area, where, they're saying, okay, if you want to do business here, we're going to have, half the IP, and that's just not fair, or patent infringement, not to mention the largest orders of beef, soybeans, and corn have now ever been placed in our country's trade history. And this will quickly tie into Trump's infamous border wall, of which 400 miles have been built, either new buildings or replacing the existing, according to Trump's viewpoint, non-functional structures. Now, the domestic working class, the lower-income individuals, are the most vulnerable to illegal labor that undercuts the market. Enforcement of the border is a key part of Trump's overall trade deal. In fact, one of his proposals was to cut illegal immigration to zero, as though it's possible, and then give 1 million additional visas to legal immigrants out there to speed up the trade route. So it wasn't. It depends on how we want to go into that, but that's another debate here. But to his voters, it's no more backroom sellouts. Fixing the problem. Democracy is defined by the nation state. The nation state is defined by borders. Trump understands this. Domestic production is key to security. Like, take a look at how strong Germany's domestic supply chains were in regard to PPE and their medical response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Enviable. And this is because they didn't ship off their entire manufacturing sector to China yet. Never discount. But these type of trade policies are the things we're going to look at as indicators as why we feel Trump's new perspective is a winning one. The special relationship between the U.S. and the U.K. is also coming into play. And while there's a lot to be ironed out, there's no question that Great Britain has a friend in Donald Trump, where in contrast, Mr. Obama instructed that the UK would be at the back of the queue should they, the sovereign nation, choose Brexit, aka their own self-determination. And now this type of global reconstruction in trade, we believe is healthy. And as we see with the U.S. and EU trade disputes evolving everything from big tech to big aerospace, while competition is healthy, the fact is since Bretton Woods, going on to the end of the gold standard in 1971 and beyond, European laws have always been quite more protectionist than the Americans, and rightly so, as that's how it works when you become the world's creditor and general pervasive currency. But as the world economic situation becomes more balanced, we must engage our grievances head on and not shy away from debate and argument with our friends. That would allow, resentment to fester. And in many ways, Trump is a bandage being pulled off that 1940 to 2016 American hegemony and seeing if the world is healed enough that it can be closer allies than sort of this Hegelian master-slave dialectic that's now both parties have an equal GDP and perhaps a new era of collaboration can emerge from, this blunt Trumpian honesty. And never forget that in great part it was the establishment diplomats, not the sovereign kings, that brought about the destruction of the concert of Europe following World War I. Too much bureaucracy has a natural defense in a democratic republic. When the people choose to send someone that doesn't adhere to conventional courtesy, this is not the same as dictatorships or extreme comparative analysis to Hitler and Stalin, but a steam valve in our system that's key to its survival midway point of the 3rd century of our republic. You send somebody who it maybe doesn't adhere to how the Senate has rebuilt their viewpoints or the prim and proper ways, but it's still within the realm of the legal system. And so I think that's where Donald Trump comes in. And finally, let's conclude and then go to questions with the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic and its response, because I'm sure that's one of the main things. And I'll start off by saying I personally had COVID back in July. It was not enjoyable, and I hope any of you who are unaffected as possibly, and if any of you have or are, I extend my heartfelt condolences or best of wishes. But when a foreign pestilence hits your land, it's easy to start pointing fingers at neighbors, as we saw with the riots or general public grocery store fights that had become commonplace on the internet. The extreme emotional toll of this pandemic is something to be aware of. The only people who President Trump and his supporters lay the blame at would be the Chinese Communist Party, who they feel covered it up for as long as possible before being caught dead to rights. President Trump routinely says China lied, people died. Nancy Pelosi was dancing in the street of Chinatown in San Francisco, telling everyone things that were just wonderful, not to fear the virus. Come on down for a cultural celebration, which actually I went to Berkeley. It's an awesome time in Chinatown. I recommend anybody go there, really the most fun. But President Trump was at the same time taking steps to restrict travel from China, something that Joe Biden called xenophobic, while the CCP at the same time had banned flights from Wuhan to the rest of China. They allowed them to go elsewhere, and places like Italy, especially, were caught in the wildfire. Now, fact-checkers often like to go after Trump and say he didn't ban travel from China, and that's true because 27,000 Americans were in mainland China and needed to return home. It's unconscionable for a U.S. president to close the border to its citizens, residents, or green card holders. That would also, I believe, be illegal. But then he went on to ban travel from mostly white Europe, and all of a sudden the ranting and raving about Trump wanting to secure borders vanished. Maybe a tight southern border at the changing 21st century with massive population rises, migration, and now viral pandemics. It might be a good idea to get a handle on the situation sooner than later, but that's just, again, our voters' perspective. Initially, nobody was prepared to the extent they should have been. Cities like New York were in full panic mode, and when they had foregone the scheduled purchase of 17,000 ventilators a few years ago to deviate the city budget elsewhere, they were the first and largest recipient of the federal response, with the USS Comfort sent by the Navy to serve as a floating hospital, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers turning the Javits Center into a 1,000-bed hospital, while the Defense Production Act was activated to start mass production of PPE and ventilators by blue-chip American companies like 3M, Ford, and General Motors. I myself work in the general term would be facilitation in a lot of ways, and I can tell you everybody and their mother was trying to sell N95 masks and sterile gloves. We had a deal we worked on personally to broker over 3 million N95 masks that was seized by FEMA for massive stockpiling, and the pathetic response to Katrina by George Bush really made sure the federal readiness level had increased drastically in the last 20 years. Our old folks' homes, however, were decimated as states like New York, New Jersey, and Michigan mandated they must take COVID patients back in their facilities. This accounted for over 50% of the deaths alone in those states. In Ohio, rates from those deaths in some months were over 60%. Places like California were strict on that being expressly forbidden and did not have the same devastation. Down here in sunny Florida, literally the land of old folks, retirement communities, and all things elderly, did not have the devastation. The states that did allow COVID patients back in their nursing home did. Even worse, New York and New Jersey only succeeded in convincing the CEOs of the nursing homes to allow them or acquiesce to these demands by giving them some forms of immunity against the inevitable legal action by family members. Our system was set up to fail in this respect because many of our elderly and most vulnerable are living together and not with their families. In countries like Turkey, where elders stay with their families in much greater numbers, we saw much less devastation, specifically at that age group. Although Turkey has fudged their numbers in general for tourism, at least we did not find the concentrated kill zones that we found in American nursing homes. Now, most importantly, looking forward, we have a roadmap to the future. The idea that we can shut down the world for what was initially 15 days to flatten the curve has become infinity days until we have 0 cases. Hidden in your home, wrapped for plastic on years on end, where your grandfather can't have a funeral unless, of course, he was a famous judge or a civil rights icon or shot by the police, in which case, never mind, unlimited funerals, public displays of rage. One would be wise to take note of how the media touts the rise in cases, but doesn't mention the hospitalization and death rates that have fallen precipitously. Now, this is going to be augmented further by the therapeutic treatments that have come out of this. Companies like Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, and Moderna, who are demonstrating that public-private partnership that can harness the best of America in our most imperative times of need. 2.2 million people were originally modeled to die. This is no longer the case. The mortality rate is down 85%, and the excess mortality rate is also down. Operation Warp Speed has been authorized by the president to rapidly deliver the coming vaccine using our men and women of the armed services and National Guard to make sure that this rollout is going to be as robust as the record-breaking pace of development. And his voters going to the polls are going to see this type of leadership that we've gotten from President Trump, a man who did not need this job, who did not need to put himself in harm's way. They see somebody who not only lost billions of dollars to take this job, but never stopped working 12-hour shifts for the American people. When he himself was struck by the virus, including his son and his wife, he was able to show strength and himself be an advertisement for the rapidly developing medical treatments and optimism we should have for the future. The Republican Party, in great part, wants prosperity for all, not disparity, equality of opportunity, not oligarchy and political chicanery, and most critically, we want capitalism, not corporatism or socialism. With innovative foreign policy to labor-first trade policies that allowed him to be both nimble and a force for calm during the pandemic, Donald Trump has been the best path that our voters see to that stated goal. Under his candidacy or presidency, we saw the largest wage growth, lowest unemployment since Vietnam when half the labor was fighting in a foreign jungle, record stock market gains, key to the retirement security and the dignity of baby boomers and their 401ks. He invested long-term in historically black colleges and put forth a platinum plan for creating generational wealth in the black community. Median household income for Hispanic communities had hit $60,000 at the peak of the Trump economic miracle and the highest female labor force participation in history. The average household income across the country was up $2,000 to $6,000. In the fourth quarter of December, GDP was around 4%, after Obama said we couldn't crack 2%. We just had a 33.1% recovery and are accelerating into Q4 to make that V shape a super V. The stock market is up, give or take, 10,000 points since election night in 2016. This is the Donald Trump's America, and our motto is, when you have patriotism in your heart, there is no room for prejudice. So I'll leave you guys with this, and we'll go to a Q&A, but as a historian, Donald Trump, to me, is a Cincinnatus figure, the legendary figure of Roman virtue, specifically civic virtue, somebody who set aside his plow, came down from his orchard, and saved the republic. In a constitutional republic, our elected officials do not always end up articulating the interests of their constituents. Thomas Jefferson often warned of this, perhaps in a more overtly revolutionary sense. And this is the proverbial swamp that Donald Trump refers to he is draining. Cincinnatus was twice appointed dictator by the Senate to save the republic from destruction, and twice relinquished that power back to the Senate and went back to his orchard. Donald Trump is not a dictator. He is not a king. He is elected president of the United States of America, who speaks for the forgotten men and women of this country. And now that they have chosen him to be their modern-day Cincinnatus inside our political system constructs. And for this, I think the world can be eternally grateful that we will not, and hopefully will not, on November 3rd, put the world's hegemonic military power back in the hands of people who wielded it with such brutality and disregard for human life, nor will we allow the U.S. government fall into the hands of those same people who march to the drumbeat of Beijing while leaving our labor force on the outs and simultaneously ignoring the generational devastation of our communities. So...
Well, Erol, thank you very much. I'm now going to open up the floor for some questions. Attendees, please raise your hand should you have a question for Erol. And thank you very much for all being muted whilst the presentation was continuing. Thank you so much. Well, Erol, I think I'll kick us off. Firstly, I was very interested to hear what you had to say about the COVID-19 reaction. I do feel that the partisan gap remains quite far apart in the Republicans' views compared to the Democrats' views of the COVID threat to public health. I read a stat recently from the Pew Research Center that indicated that 95% of Democratic-leaning voters thought that COVID was a major threat to public health, whilst only 45% of Republican-leaning voters thought it was a threat. Given the current situation in the Senate with Nancy Pelosi and Trump and the wager that they're having at the moment with the stimulus package, could you talk to us a little bit about this very complicated argument that they're having, this scenario? Say, for instance, the scenario would pan out that Trump wins tomorrow and Republican senators are also re-elected into the Senate. How will this not be resolved in terms of the stimulus package to try and help the economy get back on its feet after this terrible, terrible COVID paralysis?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's coming down to, sadly, just the dysfunction of the American political system. So the way that at least I'm understanding it is that we have the first stimulus was imperative. You could not give it. It had to have been done. As we started to see labor force participation come back in, and we were giving people the bonus per month on their check, $600 a month. After we got through that first period of time, analysts essentially saw that it was now not, I guess, life or death. And that's as soon as politicians can get wind that it's not life or death, then they start playing games with people's lives. And that's where I think we've seen that situation in the House, because essentially there's two camps. The Republican camp saying we would like to do another stimulus for the American worker. 1.8 trillion, I think, was Mnuchin's first offer. Now he's up to 2 point something. But essentially, it was going to be just for that. And the Democrats said, okay, you want that money because you want your candidate to have the bump that's going to give him, another Trump check, another Trump bailout. Well, we have a bunch of pension funds. Illinois, especially, is one of the most famous economic pension funds in the world, underfunded, and a bunch of other things that we also want funded. So to give you that political win, you're going to have to give us a political win back, because our quant people have essentially said that you're not going to lose enough votes if you can just blame them for doing it, and we can blame them. You get to the election. If they win the election, now they can get 4.8. If Trump wins the election, then they'll settle somewhere in the middle. But Trump and those guys weren't willing to give give Pelosi the $4.8 billion that she wanted to fund the rest of Democrat programs. They said, you're the ones who are blocking it because you're adding, and we're giving the amount for the American worker. And the Republican viewpoint is maybe more based in that logic. Well, it's the ruling party always gets to have the more logical argument in almost all sense of form. If you look at Fox News before Trump was president, for example, much more conspiracy based. First, if you look at CNN while Obama was president, much more mainstream. And then all of a sudden, when the parties change, you see the media change. Well, the political sphere has become almost the same as media. It's all become theater. And so now I think that's sort of the gamesmanship that's going to go in. But if Trump is to win and hold the Senate, then I think that they will the Democrats will be forced to take some concession. I think Mnuchin will give a few $1 billion of other people's money away. It seems like it's not so hard for him. So I go with that.
Okay, thank you. My attendees, has anybody else got a question for Erol, perhaps to do with foreign policy or trade or some of the other issues that arose from those big topic debates? Hi, Robin. Yes.
This is not a very well-formed question, I think, but just listening, you've articulated a lot of really rational arguments that we don't always hear from Trump himself, unfortunately. So thank you very much for kind of expressing yourself in a very interesting sort of way. I just wonder about like the draining of the swamp and the checks and balances that seem to be, a part of the historical structure of the U.S. government. I know a lot of people in the UK probably don't really understand how that works all that much. But I just keep coming back to this checks and balances and thinking that, the roadblocks, like, if you have Congress on one side and the president on one side, then, not a lot gets done. And that's really frustrating. But perhaps, that's good because then, things you have to compromise and you have to kind of find some way through muddling through in the middle. And so nothing too extreme will happen. But I just wonder, if he's wanting to drain the swamp, is he in favor of draining the swamp on both sides of this? Because you talked about the word chicanery, I love. And I just think that, there seems to be a lot of finagling and a lot of chicanery and everything going on all sides of whatever argument there is. And yeah, it's just, I don't know kind of how that's going to resolve itself, because it seems like the government is getting, and the country is getting more and more polarized. And how do you see that kind of going forward? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think I've got the scope of the question. And thank you so much. So when it's politics is a dirty business. And the people who choose to play, especially in the political arena, especially in lobbying and super PACs and stuff, I go in and out of those worlds. They're very competitive people on both sides. They're people who are win at all costs, kind of ideological people who get to some of those things. So when you get into the political arena, no matter what, the chicanery is inevitable. The question of sort of organic, natural chicanery, we could say, the tricks in the bag of every political campaign that you run is one thing compared to what I was again referring to as the Democrat-Republican oligarchy. A situation where you've got George Bush, his dad, John McCain, Sidney McCain, John McCain, rest in peace when he was here, and basically the entire Republican establishment, Mitt Romney not voting for Trump. When we say drain the swamp, it is a swamp. So there's a lot of interesting creatures you find in it that have come along the way, as you've seen with the cohort that have, sort of rotating revolving door of some of Trump's cabinet or surrounding positions. But when we're talking about draining out the people who've sent, the people who lied to us about weapons of mass destruction, the people who, took advantage of Haiti, the people who destabilized Syria and Libya, that's maybe more of what he refers to, the people who were signing those trade deals and remain in power. Dianne Feinstein, 60 years in power, 47 years for Joe Biden. These are people what's her name? Maxine Waters, another 40, 45, 49-year terms. people who've made millions of dollars in there. Bob Corker, the Republican senator, $40 million when he left. He came in with $280,000. I mean, a congressman. So I think that is more of the swamp. The idea that we can get all the bad actors and influencers and opportunists and capitalists and con men out of politics. I don't think it would be half as interesting, nor would it be maybe a free election, because you'd have to stymie that. And I think you have to trust the voters to read between the lines on some stuff. There is an incumbent responsibility to anybody as a voter, but I do think that he refers to that part of the swamp at least more than perhaps the fact that Paul Manafort is buying $40,000 ostrich jackets. Well, or whatever else, some of these other clowns are up to. So I would differentiate with that, and perhaps that would be how we view the swamp, because of sort of inevitabilities of it being a swamp. Sorry, lost my voice.
Erol, I have a few questions from students that very unfortunately couldn't join us today. Sorry, Robin, did you want to come back just before I ask these questions?
No, that's okay. Thank you. I just, do you think there's going to ever be any term limits imposed for Congress?
Ooh, that's a tough one. And I go back and forth on it myself, because in the conservative circles, you'll go to events or what are they called, convention things, and there'll be a booth there, end campaign term limits, this and that. It'll be directed at one person. And I do think that there's a short-sightedness in the same way that Lindsey Graham said you'll be sorry by ending the supermajority to Chuck Schumer about how you can confirm justices. I think it might be something that you would want. You'd be like, oh man, it would make a lot of sense. But then it takes away the self-agency of an American citizen who would want to come in and out of politics, which a lot of traditionalists would say is the ideal way to be. You don't want to have career politicians, and so I think limiting term limits, the option is there in the ballot on the election day, and I think that's where perhaps we need to see redrawing or more diverse gerrymandering or whatever, because it would perhaps be a limitation on individual liberty. But I can see every argument for it, and they're all logical. I just think it's a slippery slope, and as somebody who believes in the personal liberty of somebody to come in and out of politics, if they're of good intention, perhaps outweighs some sort of career leech like fungus that has been growing on the edge of the Congress House. Perhaps we can deal with that guy if we can perhaps have incredible people who would come in and out. So I think it's a nuanced thing, but right now I'd say I'm not personally in favor of term limits, just because I think it's a slippery slope, and it takes away the power of the individual.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.